Hello, Bellevue family. Welcome to this week's now virtual edition of our study of Ecclesiastes. Tonight we're going to be looking at Ecclesiastes chapter 7. This will be lesson 8. Hopefully the email that led you to this video also had the link to the handout, and hopefully you're able to take a look at those handouts. The handouts have a list of questions that we're going to work through as we go through chapter 7 tonight. Chapter 7 begins with the first 14 verses are written very much like Proverbs, and so we'll kind of treat this like a lightning round, if you will, going through those fairly quickly before we get into some other topics in the second half of the chapter. So as always, I'm going to read through part of the text and then we'll talk about the question that relates to that part of the text. So picking up in verse 1, it says, "A good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of birth." And the question that I have, or the two questions that I have, is why is a good name vital in a Christian's life? And why does the Qoheleth say that the day of one's death is better than the day of one's birth? And I think, those two phrases about a good name being better than precious ointment and the day of death better than the day of birth, I think they're related to one another. I think they're talking about the same topic. And starting with the good name being better than precious ointment, it very much reminds me of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount talking about believers, citizens in the kingdom of God being salt and being light, that our influence matters, our reputation matters. And thinking as Christians to know that our reputation is critically important in trying to win souls for the kingdom of God. And here the writer, the Qoheleth, Solomon, is saying that having a good reputation is better than perfume or cosmetics or something to give you the outward appearance of being good. But a good reputation is better than something that will merely affect the surface. And then he says the day of death better than the day of birth. And I think those are related, where he's saying it's better to come to the end of a life lived with a good reputation than to start off a life that is aimed at folly, aimed at following your own worldly desires. It's better to have lived a life with a good reputation than to head off at the beginning of a life seeking that which is foolish. Let's look at verses 2 through 4. He says, "It is better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting. For this is the end of all mankind, and the living will lay it to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by sadness of the face the heart is made glad. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth." And the questions that I have for this one are, why is sorrow and mourning better than feasting, laughter, and pleasure? What effect does a house of mourning have on those who are still living? And I think the emphasis here is on the brevity of life, that by, focusing on times of mourning, times of loss, we are reminded of how short life is. And in being reminded of that, we are also reminded to make the most of the time that we have, to make the most of those opportunities. If we're focusing on, the times of pleasure and times of laughter, we may waste our life away. But if we're focused on how short life is, then we'll be reminded that, hey, we need to make the most of the time that we have. It reminds me of a song that came out, I think it was a couple of years ago. And I'm going to mention this song. I'm not recommending it. I'm not recommending the artist. It's just something that it reminded me of. There was a song that came out called "If We Were Vampires," which is a weird name of a song, but the sentiment of the song is about the relationship between the singer and the writer and his wife, and how if, in this hypothetical situation, that if they were vampires, meaning that they could live forever, that he would not take their relationship as seriously as he does, because they would be able to live together forever. And so he said, I wouldn't feel the need to hold your hand. But because they have, we have a limited time together, implies that he's taking their relationship more seriously, enjoying the time that they spend together more. And again, I think this is a similar sentiment that when we're reminded of the brevity of life, we're reminded that we need to make the most of the time that we have. Make the most of the time that we have in service to God and time with our family, and just being reminded. And that will better prepare us for life than to focus on times of pleasure, times of revelry. The next section, I want to read verses 5 through 6. It says, "It is better for a man to hear the rebuke of the wise than to hear the song of fools. For as the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fools. This also is vanity." And the questions, I have, I think, 3 on this one. It says, why is it important to listen to those who are wise? How does the Qoheleth, the writer, illustrate the laughter and pleasure that a fool enjoys? And what does this say about the fool? And, part of this about, it's better to hear the rebuke of a wise is that to be wise ourselves, we have to be willing to listen to those who are wiser than we are, more experienced than we are, and even be willing to take criticism from them, which is not something that we instinctively want to do. And I love the illustration of the crackling of thorns under a pot, because if you think about a fire and you just take a bunch of thorny, branches and throw them in a fire, rather than having a sustained fire, it's just going to pop and snap and then burn up, and then it's gone away. It makes a lot of noise, and then it goes away. And so he uses that to illustrate, the speech of fools. And he says this is also as vanity. And instead of listening to those who make a lot of noise, who make a lot of bluster, and then go away, we need to be listening to those who are more experienced, those who are wise, and take instruction from them, even be willing to take criticism from them. I've got a number of references. If you've got the handout, one of those, Proverbs 13 verse 1, a wise son hears his father's instruction. Again, one who has lived and had more experience than the son. But he said a scoffer does not listen to rebuke. And again, this is similar to what Solomon, who wrote both of these books, similar to what he's saying here in Ecclesiastes chapter 7. All right, let's move down to verse 7. He says, "Surely oppression drives the wise into madness, and a bribe corrupts the heart." And the question that I have is, 2 questions. What destroys a wise man's reason or into madness, and what corrupts his heart? And I think the message here, there's a lot in Ecclesiastes about oppression and finding oppression in places where you don't expect to find oppression. But I think here, in speaking to, maybe those who hold an influential position, and saying, don't use your position to personal advantage. And then particularly, one who would use their position to an advantage would be one who would accept a bribe. That this is corruption. This is destroying your influence if you're willing to take a bribe. It corrupts you if you're willing to take a bribe. You're abusing your position. And going back to what we said in verse 1 about a good name being better than precious ointment, a reputation can be destroyed in a moment of abusing your position, of accepting a bribe, of being corrupted, and that can destroy your reputation in a moment. All right, let's look at verses 8 through 10. It says, "Better is the end of a thing than its beginning, and the patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. Be not quick in your spirit to become angry, for anger lodges in the heart of fools. Say not, why were the former days better than these? For it is not from wisdom that you ask this." And the question that I have is, how can patience keep us from behaving foolishly? And, the thought here, I believe, is that, patience is needed to see our, the things that we're involved in, to see them through to the end. We think about, rushing into something, thinking we're going to accomplish it, but not giving it this, not having the right patience, not giving it a serious enough thought. And, whenever we hit, the first roadblock, we cast it aside because we become discouraged and we don't want to fight through. And then, to verse 9 about becoming angry with others, we could even become, when we hit those roadblocks, we hit those discouragements because we're not patient. We lash out at others as an excuse for us not taking it seriously, us not having enough perseverance and enough patience to see something through to the end. It reminds me very much of James. In James chapter 1, James says, "Know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger." And, in this case, he's talking about putting God first and being patient with trying to put yourself out there in the front. All right, let's look at verses 11 and 12. It says, "Wisdom is good with an inheritance, an advantage to those who see the sun. For the protection of wisdom is like the protection of money, and the advantage of knowledge is that wisdom preserves the life of him who has it." And the question that I have there is two questions. What two things does man use as a shelter or a defense? And which of these two things is better for man, and why? And the two things that are being discussed here are wisdom and money. And he starts off talking about, wisdom is good if you have an inheritance. And how many humans, fantasize about what it would be like to come into a large sum of money, whether that's from an inheritance or from winning the lottery or whatever it might be, and thinking that, if I can come into this big sum of money, it's going to take away all my problems. It's going to solve all my problems. I don't have to work anymore. I don't have to earn a living. I won't have any worries anymore. And the writer here is saying that if you do come into money, I hope that you have wisdom to go along with it, because wisdom is very, very important. As a matter of fact, he says that the security that comes with wisdom is much greater than the security that comes with money. It's much, much better at defending your life, at securing your life, at providing shelter is wisdom over money. Go down to verses 13 and 14. These are the last two of kind of the Proverbs before we move back into kind of the normal way of writing that Solomon uses in this book. He says, "Consider the work of God. Who can make straight what he has made crooked? In the day of prosperity, be joyful. And in the day of adversity, consider, God has made the one as well as the other, so that man may not find out anything that will be after him." The questions that I have there is, how should we regard the work of God? What should we do in days of prosperity or in days of adversity, and why? I think the overall message in the way we regard the work of God is that God is sovereign. When he says that who can make straight what he has made crooked, Solomon is not saying that, by saying that God has made some things crooked, that God has erred, that God has sinned, that God has problems, but instead that God is sovereign and God is in control. And it kind of points back, back to Ecclesiastes chapter 3, where it talks about, God has made everything beautiful in its time. There's a time for everything, and God is the one who is in control. And, no matter how hard we fight against something or we try to do something our way, ultimately God is going to be in control. And then the latter part of this in verse 14 is that, we're going to face times of prosperity and joy, but we're also going to face times of adversity. And, the key thing there is that in all those situations, we have to continue to look to God, remembering that God is in control. And I've got a number of references in the handout, but one that, always sticks with me, it's such an encouraging passage from Philippians chapter 4 that I've referenced a lot in this study, that Paul, down in verses 10 and 11, 10, 11, 12, 13 of Philippians 4 is talking about how, I have learned how to be content in every situation. He says, I know how to be brought low. This is in verse 12. And I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Paul says, I can be content no matter what situation I'm in. And that's essentially what Solomon is saying here, is, look at, God is in control, and we're going to have good days and bad days, and we need to be content in all those situations, and no matter what we're facing. All right, let's move down to verse 15. Again, a little bit different style of writing here, more like what we've seen earlier in Ecclesiastes. He says in verse 15, "In my vain life I have seen everything. There is a righteous man who perishes in his righteousness, and there is a wicked man who prolongs his life in his evil doing." And so now you are back to thinking about the vanity of life, life under the sun. And I've got the question, what two things had the Koheleth, the writer, seen in the days of his vanity? And he says, the two things are, I saw a righteous man who perished in his righteousness, where, we might think, well, the one whose righteousness, he should have everything going his way. And then he says there's the wicked man who prolongs his life in his evil doing. And we might think, well, the one who's wicked, he should be the one who faces trouble. And the note that I have there is just that life doesn't fit into an equation under the sun. We can't look at life under the sun and expect it to always work out the way that we want it to. It's not always going to make sense. Matter of fact, most of the time, it's not going to make sense. We're not going to think it's fair. We're not going to think that justice has been served. And that is the nature of life. And that's why, as Christians, it's critical for us to put our anchor, the weight of our life, somewhere other than in this life. We have to put it above the sun with God, where it doesn't change, because here, we can't know for certain what's going to happen, and it's always going to be disappointing. Let's go to verses 16 through 18. The writer says this, the Koheleth, "Be not overly righteous, and do not make yourself too wise. Why should you destroy yourself?" Then verse 17, he says, "Be not overly wicked, neither be a fool. Why should you die before your time?" Verse 18, he says, "It is good that you should take hold of this, and from that withhold not your hand, for the one who fears God shall come out from both of them." Now, these three verses have been taken 100 different ways by scholars and commentators. And some have tried to use this to say that Solomon is arguing that a little bit of wickedness is okay, or that righteousness is not always a good thing. Let me tell you what I think what I think he means here. I think if you look at verses 16 and 17 and you balance those, that what he's saying is, don't model your life after when he says, don't be overly righteous, don't make yourself too wise. I think he's talking about the self-righteous, where you're righteous and you're wise in your own eyes. Think the Pharisees. Jesus was always talking about how the Pharisees, were hypocrites. They appeared one way on the outside, but on the inside they were something completely different. They were seen by others and by themselves as being incredibly righteous, but Jesus was always pointing out that their life did not reflect what people saw in them or what they thought about themselves, because they were self-righteous. And so he says, don't model your life after the self-righteous, the ones that are too wise, that are too righteous, but also don't model your lives after the worldly. Don't model your lives after the wicked. Not saying that a little bit of wickedness is okay, but neither is the right model for our lives. But instead of trying to take a view of the self-righteous or take a view of the worldly, instead look to God, fear God instead. And God, if you look to God, if you fear God, then you'll be able to navigate between the self-righteous and the worldly. And I think that's what he's saying there. All right, let's go down to verse 19. He says, "Wisdom gives strength to the wise man more than 10 rulers who are in a city." And the question that I have there is simply, how strong is wisdom? And definitely he says it's, wisdom is stronger than 10 rulers who are in a city. Just saying that wisdom is it's a more powerful tool than any government, any army, any military. Wisdom is a powerful ally. It's a powerful tool to have. Go down to verses 20 through 22. He says, surely there is not a righteous man on earth who does good and never sins. Do not take to heart all the things that people say, lest you hear your servant cursing you. Your heart knows that many times you yourself have cursed others. And this is there's a lot in here. But, the first part of this is that life has to be lived with the awareness that no one's perfect. And I mean, we know that conceptually. We understand that nobody can live a perfect life. We are not perfect and others are not perfect. We're going to disappoint people. They're going to disappoint us. So that's the first message here, is that there's no such thing as sinless perfection. There's no such thing as a sinless life, a perfect life. And then with that, we have to approach our interactions with others with genuineness and sincerity. And that, we should not be engaged in things like gossip, because he's saying if you're engaged in gossip, you may end up hearing a criticism against yourself. And that might end up being true. And if you do that, well, keep in mind that, how many times you have gossiped and criticized others. All of that stemming because we're not perfect. We're not perfect. And so, I think there's a message here of understanding that we're not perfect, using that to be humble before others, to be sincere before others, to be genuine before others, and to not be engaged in gossip, because none of us are perfect. None of us can say that we are perfect. Go down to verses 23 through 25. And by the way, the rest of these verses from 23 through the end of the chapter through 20, I think it's 23 through the end through 29, all of these deal with the writer, the Qoheleth, Solomon's belief that wisdom or finding a wise person is an exceedingly rare thing. And so he says this, all this I have tested by wisdom. I said, I will be wise, but it was far from me. That which has been is far off and deep, very deep. Who can find it? I turned my heart to know and to search out and to seek wisdom and the scheme of things, and to know the wickedness of folly and the foolishness that is madness. The question that I have there is, in his effort to be wise, what did the Qoheleth find? And what he found is that the quest for wisdom is a difficult quest. Notice he says, it was far from me. It was far off, deep, very deep. Who can find it? I wanted to know the scheme of things. I wanted to know how everything works, how everything fits together. Kind of reminds of earlier where he had said that God has set eternity on man's heart, that we want to understand how God works, how everything works. And he says this quest, even though in the first chapter, he had said that I have acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were over Jerusalem before me. And my heart has had great experience of wisdom and knowledge. Even with that, he says, it's far from me. It's far off. It's deep. It's very deep. Who can find it out? And that same thing continues in verse 26. He says, and I find something more bitter than death. This is in that quest for wisdom, or quest to find those who are wise. I find something more bitter than death. The woman whose heart is snares and nets, and whose hands are fetters. He who pleases God escapes her, but the sinner is taken by her. And the question I have, or two questions, is what did he find more bitter than death? And who can escape such a woman? And I have to believe that, Solomon using the woman and the snare of a woman as an example here has to come from his life experiences. If you go look in 1 Kings chapter 11, you can read that Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines. So he had a little bit of experience in dealing with women. And apparently his experiences were not good. We're going to see more of that later. But, from what we read back in chapter 2, Solomon, part of his quest to find pleasurable things, that he surrounded himself with women, with wives, as part of his quest for pleasure, his quest for happiness. And obviously that has led to a great deal of frustration and futility. And here, he exemplifies that with referring to the woman whose heart is snares and nets. But really the picture is of anything that is a snare and a net, coming from the devil. That there are all kinds of snares and nets that, traps that Satan is setting for us that are out there, that are difficult to escape. But he gives us, even though he's kind of zeroed in on this one type of snare for a man to be ensnared by a woman, the snare that can come from Satan, the key here is that we have to be seeking to please God, and only through God can we receive the power to escape the snares of the devil. Only through the power of God and His Holy Spirit, because otherwise we're going to be caught by the snares of the devil. Now, continuing on with that, that idea of him being focused on women, this next text is both interesting and controversial, and some would even say difficult to explain. Look at verses 27 and 28. He says, "Behold, this is what I found." Now remember, this is that, he said, I went on a quest for wisdom. I went on a quest for wisdom. It was far off. It was deep. It was hard to understand, hard to find. And so he says, "Behold, this is what I found," says the preacher, while adding one thing to another to find the scheme of things. Back he had said, I'm looking for wisdom. I'm trying to understand the scheme of things. I'm trying to understand how everything fits together, how everything works. Verse 28, he says, "Which my soul has sought repeatedly, but I have not found. One man among 1,000 I found, but a woman among all these I have not found." Now, this is one of those passages that if you were to look in 10 different commentaries, you would find 10 different explanations about the numbers that he uses, the one man out of 1,000, the no women out of 1,000. The question that I have written down is, in his search, what had the Qoheleth found and not found? What is the significance of these numbers? And I'm going to tell you, I think it's difficult to interpret, but I think, again, just like in the previous question, that Solomon's view on this is twisted by his own life experience, by saying that, well, I found one man out of 1,000, again, with that idea that it's exceptionally rare to find someone who's wise, but I found no women out of 1,000 because Solomon, 700 wives, 300 concubines, that's 1,000 women, and he's kind of saying, I've had my share of struggles with women. And so his own life experience has kind of twisted this in his mind. Some have suggested that maybe when he says one man out of 1,000, he was referring to himself. Some have said that maybe this is a messianic prophecy, that it's a pointing toward Jesus, who would be the one man who would truly exemplify wisdom. But I think it's more general than that. I think the overall theme of these verses is that, in his view, wisdom is something that is exceedingly rare. And because of his pursuit of women to the extreme, his heart has been turned so that he says, well, there aren't even any women that I would consider to be wise, even though only one out of 1,000 men would be wise. I don't take this as this is the message from God. This is the message of a man whose view has been twisted by his life lived under the sun. His view of men and women has been twisted because he has been so focused on making himself happy by acquiring things, building things, having all these women, that his view of others has been twisted. The last verse, he says, "See, this alone I found, that God made man upright, but they have sought out many schemes." And the simple question I have there is, what else had he found? And he says, "I found that God had made man upright." And I think this is probably a reference all the way back to Genesis, that, when God was creating things, including creating man and woman, he referred to all of that as being good, that man was created to be good. Man was created to be upright. And, when we were given the freedom to choose, we had one thing that we couldn't do, and we were given the ability to choose. And what did we choose? We chose to do the thing that God had told us not to do. We were made to be upright, but through our schemes, we have gone off on our own path. And God, from that point forward, has been working to bring us back which ultimately that culminated in the sacrifice of his son. So, this last part all being about wisdom and the, wisdom and vanity and all those two things kind of going head to head, and his own kind of twisted view of the world, especially his twisted view of women because of his own life experiences of having 700 wives and 300 concubines, and his, life lived unto itself has kind of twisted his view in that manner. So I thank you for hanging with me tonight. I thank you for hanging with me through a video this week. I hope you all have a safe and wonderful rest of your week, and hope you will join us next week. Thank you all very much.